Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Nostalgia. In this episode, we talk about the monoculture and Web 1, which is the early internet, the progression of subculture in tandem with the emergence of social media, and the culture of AIM, Xanga, and Myspace, aka my favorite corners of the internet. Note, this is not going to necessarily be chronological, so stay with me here because we're examining the past through a contemporary lens. I will be comparing different iterations of the internet, different technological advancements, and different cultural norms from various eras. So, first, let's start with a little Wikipedia moment, aka Wikipedia, but in the nostalgia world. Here are the two terms you're going to need to know as we move along: monoculture and subculture. So, monoculture. Mono means one, so one culture. I feel like we mention this in every episode now, so that's why we're going to get into it a little bit more today. Monoculture is the product of the mainstream, aka what's generally popular, shown in the media, and widely accessible to a mass audience. That's what popular, aka pop culture is. And then on the other hand, a subculture, it's actually a very, very broad term that describes the groups that develop their own norms and values, although the people are still participating in mainstream society. They're not meant to appeal to the masses in the way that pop culture is. And a few examples are punks, goths, skaters, bikers, hipsters, the queer community, the hip hop community, grunge, K pop, anime, cosplay, even surfers. But I could go on. The main point that I want to make here is that social media is an amalgam of subculture. So subculture is the mainstream now. And when everything is trending, hashtagged, aestheticized, it's accessible to all. And an algorithm curates what you see. Therefore, making subculture in itself kind of like an oxymoron. And this thought was inspired by an article I read in Time last week. I'm going to link it in the show notes. It's called Welcome to the Era of Unapologetic Bad Taste. It mentions Celine Dion. So it was like, if liking Celine Dion is in bad taste, then I have bad taste. And I'm not afraid to tell everyone about it. But I wanted to share a quote from it that really just articulates the point here. So, in reference to Gen Z, they, quote, largely replaced IRL subcultures with a constellation of aesthetics: cottagecore, dark academia, Y2K, to be performed, then discarded or demoted to just another aesthetic in the rotation. Black mesh used to signify a goth identity. Now, it doesn't make you a Cure fan any more than a floral frock makes you a denizen of a cottage in the English countryside. There's obviously something shallow about trading genuine cultural affinity for cosplay, yet it also reflects an understanding that style can signify a fleeting personal or societal mood more than a fixed identity. I thought that was so interesting. We're really going to explore that relationship between the evolution of the internet and social media with the way that subcultures are represented. But first, so we see how we got to where we are present day, we're going to explore the monoculture. So from the, let's say, 1950s to the mid 2010s or so, before streaming eclipsed cable subscriptions in households across America, everyone was watching the same few TV shows and movies. The same things were popular because access to anything else was not the norm or it was limited. Sidebar, I'm going to talk about music a little bit separately. This is primarily referring to TV. Monoculture is the water cooler culture, where people would go to the office in the morning, gather around the water cooler or the coffee machine or the common area, and talk about the episode of TV that was on last night. And it was something that brought people together. And until message boards, online forums, chat rooms in the late 90s or so, you couldn't just talk with random strangers who also love Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Bette Midler. Another sidebar, I just finished Evan Ross Katz's book about Buffy, and I Love My Computer Because My Friends Live in It by Jess Kimball Leslie. So these are highly relevant references if you haven't read either of them. And if you haven't, they're both great. So yeah, you would just talk to people you knew about a show. Oh, but what if they didn't see the show or they didn't have HBO Max or Showtime or Peacock or whatever? No, everyone saw it. Tens of millions of people saw it. Actually, it's kind of insane to look at TV rating statistics from the late 20th century, aka 1900s. The most watched broadcasts of all time are pretty much all Super Bowls, other than the finale of MASH in 1983, which had 106 million viewers. That's insane. For context, New York City has like 8 million people in it. Also, Dallas's 1980 Who Done It episode with 83.6 million. By the way, MASH, I've never seen this show because it was, before the time, but it is about a troop of soldiers in the Korean War. Dallas was a primetime soap opera. Next was the 1993 series finale of Cheers at 80.5 million, which was a sitcom set in a bar and about the bartenders and their patrons. I watched some of that show. It was good. Let's see. Ooh, the February 23rd, 1994 broadcast of lady singles figure skating at the 1994 Olympics, 78.8 million. That was the one with Nancy Kerrigan and Tanya Harding. Did you see I, Tanya? I did. I thought it was pretty good. And then the 1983 television film The Day After at 76.7 million, which was about like nuclear war. Okay, next, more TV statistics. Does anybody else find this interesting? I do. Okay. The most watched series of the decade. Here we go. 1950s was I Love Lucy. 60s was Bonanza, which was a Western. 70s was All in the Family, which was a sitcom. 80s was The Cosby Show. 90s was 60 Minutes, which is like a little bit boring. So the second most watched was ER, which was about the ER, the emergency room. People are like, what about Seinfeld? Seinfeld was third. And what's interesting is that in the 90s too, Nielsen, which is the like media research company that puts together all these statistics, they changed how they recorded this data. They switched from households to viewers. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then in the 2000s, American Idol really reigned supreme there. And in the 2010s, the most popular broadcasting was football. And it's interesting too, because in the 2010s, that was when I don't remember when streaming started to come into play, but I do remember I had Netflix in the early 2010s. About 2010, I think I had Netflix. Remember, they actually used to send out physical DVDs, and that was their main method of business. This was when Redbox was still super popular. I had Netflix when I worked at the front desk at the gym at my college, and I remember getting the DVDs sent to my college mailbox so I could watch them on my laptop while I worked. The work ethic. Anyway, in the 2000s or the 2010s, you would have to buy a box set of DVDs to ever watch whatever episode you wanted to at any given moment. You didn't binge episodes unless there was a marathon on TV and unless a show was running in syndication, meaning rerun episodes were shown after their original air date. You couldn't just watch any show. And before DVDs, there were VHS tapes, which I literally just found out today stands for Video Home System, which I feel like kind of makes no sense, which is probably why they're obsolete. And other than the fact that the tape needed to be rewound every time you watched it, be kind, rewind. Anyway, speaking of Blockbuster, as we do, you would rent VHS tapes from the video store or buy them and play them on the VCR, aka video cassette recorder, which, yes, does that. So you could record an episode of TV onto a VHS tape, or you could play a tape as well. I remember one of my best friends had the OC box set, and I was like so jealous. It came with all 4 seasons in this giant package. It was amazing. And when I was maybe 7 or 8 for Christmas one year, my dad got me the I Dream of Jeannie VHS box set. I was so obsessed. And then I also had a Polly Pocket It was I Dream a Genie, but it was Polly Pocket. So it was like the bottle, and one side was her wedding, and one side was the beach. I think I found it on Etsy actually. I should probably rebuy it. Anyway, people say the monoculture is dead now, but I don't necessarily agree. Its reign has ended for sure, simply due to the sheer existence of more than three networks to choose from. But is it dead? I don't think we can really say that because there will always be something that draws a mass audience. In the 2000s, it was The Office and Harry Potter. In the 2010s, it was Game of Thrones, Marvel movies, Stranger Things, like things that are not particularly niche. You could even argue that everyone has seen Bridgerton or Euphoria, but I wouldn't classify that as monoculture because it's not TV for the masses. And part of the dissolution of monoculture also has to do with the aging population. There are two factors at play here: subject matter and the technological learning curve. So, for subject matter, you can see that before the 1990s, TV ratings were measured in household numbers because families were watching TV together. Unlike now with streaming, Netflix, HBO Max, so many other platforms, you not only have a different profile for every member of your household, but many people saw the same program because it was appropriate to watch with your entire family. And so now there's content that's not necessarily family friendly, or it would not be allowed to air on a cable network. Euphoria is literally the antithesis of being appropriate. Same with Bridgerton, at least season one, episode 6 that I watched with my mom. She tried to fast forward it, but then went too far and then had to rewind it and then stopped right in the middle of it, which I thought was very funny, but she didn't think it was funny. The other factor is the technological learning curve. Like I mentioned before with VCRs, VHSs, boom boxes, and tape players, video game consoles, Walkmans to play CDs, then DVDs, TiVo, which was the first time you could pause, rewind, or fast forward TV and record and store programs on your actual TV instead of a videotape, computers, iPads. I could go on. It all became too much technology to keep up with. The sheer rate of technological advancement in the late 20th century, or at least the second half of the 20th century, collapsed more innovation than people meaning adults who had lived in the first half of the 20th century, had ever seen in their entire life. My Grammy says actually she barely knows how to use the VCR, and I said it's totally okay. No one under the age of 20 knows how to use one either. I'd also say you can compare the monoculture to Web 1 or static read only web pages that the first iteration of a mass adopted internet consisted of. People go on their computers and visit the few websites that were out there, just like they'd watch the few TV shows that were on at one time. And I think that the monoculture really started to fracture with the advent of Web 2, the next iteration of the internet, aka social media. On social media, websites weren't read only, they were read write. You could contribute to these websites. You could express yourself, your personality, your interests, and identify as a member of a subculture. So, blogging is an excellent example of that bridge between Web 1 and Web 2 because there could be feedback both ways between what we now call a content creator and their audience. Blogging sites gained popularity in the late 90s with LiveJournal, which was so popular, even the Game of Thrones writer was on it. Found that out today too. It literally was that, an online journal, which was revolutionary at the time. And this would open the door to vlogging and influencing as we know it today. There was also Blogger, launched in 1999, which was the first blog site hosted by Google after Google acquired it in 2003. Xanga was my personal favorite, which launched in 1999 and which I used obsessively from 2003 to 2005 or so, sandwiched in between my AIM and Myspace eras. And you can't talk about blogs without mentioning Tumblr. It started in 2007, much later, because Tumblr was more of a Web 2 platform, a microblogging subculture site born in the social media generation. But Tumblr culture is its own episode, lol. And also, I think that it's not, I think it is reflective of the 2010s much more than the 2000s. All right. So while blogging was going on, AOL, aka America Online, was going strong with the company sending approximately 80 bazillion discs to our houses. The devil works hard, but whoever worked at direct mail for AOL in the 90s worked harder. They had what is likely and notoriously probably the most aggressive direct mail campaign in the history of the universe. So, yeah, people had to get free internet access via the CD that you would get in the mail. Honestly, I'm the age where I was old enough to live in the dial-up age where I recognize that awful sound when like you couldn't use the phone while you used the computer. But I'm young enough to have no idea why. Like, I'm not going to explain dial up internet or fax machines or pagers or beepers because I don't actually know how they work. And a few months ago, I had my parents explain to me what collect calls were, and I was like, that makes no sense. Anywho, AIM culture. AIM launched in 1997, and you could have it separate from AOL. So AIM is America Online Instant Messenger, right? I did not have AOL, which was the only way you would get to hear the famous "You've got mail" announcement. Like I mentioned, there were these chat rooms for specified interests that people would go on with America Online. And yeah, I think most of them were like seedy and creepy, and it was no place for children. And the late 90s and early 2000s was a time where people were skeptical at best, if not afraid of the internet. And on AIM, I got my own screen name when I just started middle school. My screen name was Dancer Baby 4273. Baby is spelled Baybee. And that's all I have to say about that. If you don't already remember the sounds that AIM would make, please look it up on YouTube. It is so entertaining. Or just actually watch the intro to Nostalgia because all of the noises are there. The opening and closing of the door, when someone would sign on or sign off, those message notifications, amazing. So with AOL and AIM, you signed on, you had a buddy list. This would be all your friends. You could send them a message. You would have a buddy icon, which is kind of like a profile picture now, but it would never be a picture of you. It would be a picture of something animated, like a Dolls Mania doll. You had an away message because remember, we weren't on the internet 24/7 then. You didn't have a cell phone maybe even at all, let alone one with an internet connection, let alone one that you would carry not even in your pocket, but in your hand at all times with no exceptions. Hence, an away message. Your away message would either be acronyms like BRB, LOL, BBS, be right back, laugh out loud, be back soon, which I still unironically say to this day, or emo song lyrics, Dashboard Confessional was my personal favorite. More on emos later. This was the place on AIM where people could be passive aggressive because this was before subtweeting existed. You could put moody lyrics in an away message in response to a breakup, a fight with a friend, or take someone's name out of your bio. It would speak volumes. In your AIM bio, you would put song lyrics, you would put initials of people in your friend group, and then see glaring omissions. Again, so shady. Or even you could put the initials of your significant other and the date that you started dating with a heart, which is stylized as a little carrot and a 3 to make a heart. Amazing. Speaking of bios, absolutely unhinged formatting behavior would take place. There would be tons of, what do you call them, glyphs, like asterisks, aka stars, tildes, like the squiggle over the Spanish letter Nye, and the Delia's like font where every other letter would be capitalized. It was complete chaos. And the font colors as well. The things that people would use, legibility of like 0. I personally preferred a light yellow background with a light blue letter. Was it unhinged because we were children, or was it the culture itself? Who's to say, really? I actively used AIM from 2001 until, I don't even know. at least 2005. It definitely overlapped with my MySpace usage, which I started in 2005, but may have ended in 2006 when I got Facebook. It's hard to pinpoint it. There's this Fox article about AIM culture, which I will link in the show notes, that says how the prevalence of these acronyms, BRB, LOL, BBS, etc., it shows how homogenous AIM culture really was for its 50 million plus users. And it also mentions how AIM couldn't thrive in Web 2.0 with new social media platforms like Twitter in 2006, Instagram in 2010, and Snapchat in 2011. AIM does not count as Web 2 because you could only access it through that one portal, your desktop computer. It lacks mobility and it lacks a mobile experience. And social media could only exist in the form as we know it because of the mass simultaneous introduction and adoption of internet-enabled mobile phones, aka smartphones. In the AIM and the MySpace days, you could not access these programs from your phone. One, because they didn't exist in that form, but two, because most people didn't even have cell phones yet, let alone ones that could connect to the internet. Websites didn't even develop mobile versions until the 2010s. I don't remember if I mentioned this on the 2010s episode, but remember Mobile View? I remember thinking in the late 2000s, I cannot wait until they optimize websites for mobile, and now there's an app for everything. Maybe I do talk about it in the episode why 2010s nostalgia is already back. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, definitely check it out. Okay, so I mentioned Xanga a little while ago. And other than recounting every literal single thing I did with my friends in ninth grade on the internet, I would also go to Xanga sites to download music. So Napster, LimeWire, who's relaunching as an NFT platform, which is kind of amazing, and Kaza? No, Kazaa, among others, were already wildly successful, or at least from a user base perspective, seeing as they were not successful at not getting sued for facilitating illegal music piracy. There were Xanga sites where you could illegally download music. I would have never been able to download Napster onto my computer because my dad was so good about defragging and antivirus stuff. I would have to go to a friend's house to go on her like virus ridden computer. And this was actually different than my friend's house, who I would go to play The Sims, which would take all of like 4 hours to load, only for us to enter the cheat code so we could buy an unlimited amount of furniture. I wish I could use that IRL. Furniture is so expensive. But because I'm an anthropologist, not just a pop culture anthropologist, but also in that I interned at anthropology, I think I can DIY, build, spray paint, or hot glue anything. My next apartment is going to be pop culture themed, and I just cannot wait for you to see it. We will do a special nostalgia episode on it. Also, Xanga had sites specifically dedicated to providing HTML code for your MySpace site. And this is how I learned to code. And as you may know, I style my website with HTML and CSS to this day because it's something super fun for me to practice. Okay, MySpace culture. This is much like Chris Carrabba of Dashboard Confessional said, hands down, my favorite internet era. Everything was new, exciting, and the internet hadn't completely integrated with, or for many people, completely taken over our lives. You would have a friend list, and your absolute best friends, or maybe your favorite bands or celebrities, would be in your top 8. And like your AIM bio, this was highly political. Like if you had people in the wrong order or if top 8 placement wasn't reciprocal, it could potentially have real life repercussions. You would write on people's walls, like how Facebook ended up introducing, and write bulletins, which Facebook, I think, introduced as notes. I'll include a link to in the show notes from an article from Alternative Press about MySpace culture. Bulletin surveys were so funny. They were semi personal questions that you would answer and basically just write it for your crush to see it or have inside jokes with all your friends. It was in good fun, and it's very funny to look back on them, but it's considered very cringy now actually. So like I mentioned, Facebook kind of introduced this in the way of notes. And on Facebook Memories, it came up on my sister's that I had done one of those surveys. But we went through it together and it actually aged pretty well. I was so proud of myself. Okay. MySpace was also the platform for musicians. So many musicians of the time were discovered through MySpace. And this is the part where, in case you didn't already know, I was MySpace friends with Aubrey Graham, aka child adolescent actor from the one and only Degrassi the Next Generation, aka Drake. I was literally MySpace friends with Drake. Like, I discovered him. I can't believe it. Anyway, so I discovered Drake on MySpace. I think, wasn't Justin Bieber? No, that was YouTube. Whatever. A lot of people were discovered on MySpace. I cannot overstate its impact on music in general, let alone the emo music scene. The two are inextricably linked. You could even have your own song on your MySpace page. I definitely had Dark Blue by Jack's Mannequin. I can remember several of my friends' MySpace songs too. If you remember yours, please reach out to me and tell me. I would love to hear it. Speaking of, quick sidebar, as the Nostalgia podcast grows, we're setting up an ecosystem consisting of, yes, the podcast, but also the newsletter, the shop, and the community. So I've been writing a private newsletter for the last 3+ years, but we're moving over to Substack next week, the first week of June, and I'll be sending out my first email over there. So there are multiple tiers, ways for you to get involved. So the free tier, Friendster, which I actually don't know anything about the culture of Friendster since that social networking site was slightly before my time, but I like it enough to name a tier after it. The paid tier is called Buddy List, and then an annual premium tier, Top 8. You will get weekly roundups on digital, internet, and pop culture, and long-form thought leadership pieces on pop culture, which will mirror what we discuss here on the podcast. Friendsters get these monthly, Buddy Listers get them weekly. Buddy Listers also get the full post archive and bonus podcast episodes. And Top 8, it will not be limited to 8 people, don't worry. You will get your own nostalgia box. Fun! Head to nostalgia.substack.com/about for more information. The shop will be a nostalgia-inspired template store. More info on that soon. And the community will be on Discord, which is also on the roadmap. That is just essentially somewhere we can go. We can talk about the Delia's catalog. We can talk about the Limited 2 photo booth. We can talk about our MySpace songs, our AIM screen names, who our favorite boy band member was, Lance, everything like that, because we need a place. Okay, so MySpace, like blogging, it was also kind of like Web 1.5 between Web 1 and Web 2 because it was a place you could also communicate with strangers. I literally met people at the mall through friends who met people on MySpace, or I'd know someone from MySpace who was going to the same event as me, which were mostly live local bands in a church basement. I don't know why. We all live the same life. But then I would see them in person, we would become friends. Or I met IRL friends from IRL friends who had once only been MySpace friends. This is highly, highly normalized now with social media. And even after apps like Foursquare or Instagram made it the norm to share your location publicly. But then it was still new. And on MySpace too, people would comment PC for PC, which is like picture comment for picture comment, or F for F, meaning follow for follow. Another odd sensation was this thing called whore trains, which the name alone tells you how misogynistic the culture of the 2000s was. Not that the internet isn't that way now. In case you've ever been on Twitter, you would know this, but it was a different time in general. And what it meant was very similar to influencer pods now. You would have so-called rules and engage with each other's content. And people in these trains, mostly women, would be like internet people, aka they have a lot of MySpace friends and a large online presence. It's actually funny how this was literally the precursor to influencer culture, where again, now this behavior is not only normalized, but coveted by the Instagram influencer era. Whereas with MySpace, you were looked down upon if you had too many friends because making friends on the internet was still considered weird. It would be odd or not commonplace to have friends that you had never met in real life before. Also, MySpace and Facebook were places where you had friends, insinuating some kind of mutual connection or two-way street, whereas Twitter and Instagram introduced the notion of followers, creating one-sided, kind of superficial relationships that have cursed us and plagued our collective self-esteem ever since. Anyway, on MySpace, it was really where we saw these stark subcultures in a way that really in the 2000s only Tumblr also had. They were dark. They were internet kids. Internet kids weren't the so-called popular kids. They might have been introverted, not even necessarily interested in technology at that point. The common thing was that, like everybody, they were looking for a sense of belonging. Maybe because they felt rejected or misunderstood at school or in real life. The internet was an outlet. I loved emo culture because I'm a very emotional person. I loved the internet and the culture because it aided my access to music, and I've always loved music. You have to remember, too, especially with that kind of access at your adolescence and coming of age, you get to have some kind of ownership of your identity and you're getting to decide who you are. And then with social media, you get to communicate who you are and you get to find other people who are like minded and believe in the same things as you and who enjoy the same music as you, dress the same way as you. And that is how all of these little subcultures and niches form. And especially in the early 2000s, too, when it comes to having access to, let's say, music. I mean, for me, until then, I only had access to the physical CDs that maybe my parents were able to buy for me or my parents owned for themselves, or I had to wait to hear a song on the radio. Okay, the only time I've ever requested a song on the radio was to hear S Club 7's Never Had a Dream Come True in 2002. And I think I waited for 2 hours. It felt like an entire day, but it was probably only 2 hours. I think the CD with that song on it hadn't come out in the US yet. Like I said, there was no way to listen to it whenever I wanted at that point. But yeah, only in the early 2000s could I be a fan of both S Club 7 and Sum 41 simultaneously. I think a lot about, again, this is a very glaring generalization of Gen X, but like the don't be a sellout ethos of that generation and the gatekeeping around identities, which we did talk a little bit about in last episode with Barbara. You definitely have to listen if you haven't yet. And these identities, particularly around male centric music, so punk rock, punk pop, and emo, namely. What I mean by this, if this was 40 years ago and you were someone who identified as punk, you would only listen to that music, you would only wear certain clothes, you would only hang out with certain people. It was truly a part of your lifestyle. Same thing with grunge 30 years ago, and finally with emo 20 years ago. But even emo itself is an umbrella. You have hardcore, metal, scene, straight edge, so many other microcultures represented. So, in a way that it's similar to punk or grunge culture, emo's also similar and is that turning point, similar to Gen Z TikTok emos of today, experiencing nostalgia for a time that they didn't live firsthand. So the advent of social media was that point where people could cherry pick subcultures to make a part of their identity, as evidenced very obviously in today's youth culture with Y2K, emo, goth, cottagecore, dark academia, e-girl, visco girl, old money, twee, indie sleaze. Now everything ever is a micro trend. It's a rapidly evolving door of aesthetics. And because of the internet, because we can choose at any given moment who we want to be and how we want to represent ourselves on social media, you can kind of hop from one subculture to another. And you might just end up on a different person's For You page. I think that's so interesting. Phew, lots to think about here. Well, I had a great time with you today. Feel free to tag me in your IG story telling me what your AOL screen name was or what your Myspace song was. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Don't forget to subscribe to Nostalgia, follow, rate, review Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your shows, or watch Nostalgia on YouTube or Spotify. See you next time. Bye.